Just giving all the participants a moment to join, and we'll start momentarily. Okay. Welcome everyone to this webinar. My name is Olivia Allen, and I am the facilitator of the Water Adaptation Community at the Global Center on Adaptation. GCA is an international organization working as a solutions broker to accelerate action and support for climate adaptation solutions. Before we get started today, I'm here to introduce you to the chair for today's webinar. GCA strongly believes that young people have an important role to play in climate actions and debates. Therefore, I'm very pleased to introduce Aoife Fleming, a young professional focused on international climate affairs. Aoife is a youth leadership and education officer at GCA, where she coordinates the 6 regional youth adaptation forums on the road to the Africa Climate Summit. The first 4, which have brought together over 4,000 young people from around the world. She is also the former UN Youth Representative on Sustainable Development for the Netherlands, where she worked on requesting an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate change and human rights. This is a topic that she continues to work on through the youth movement, World's Youth for Climate Justice. She also holds a master's degree in financial law. Thank you, Aoife, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Olivia, and welcome everybody to this webinar on integrated coastal zone management for climate resilience. This is the 3rd webinar in a 4-part series on future-proofing climate adaptation of deltas, coasts, and small islands through action, political will, and financing. Thank you also to our organizers, the IPDC, GCA, and Deltares, and our speakers for joining us. And thank you, of course, to you, our participants, for being with us today. We anticipate that this webinar will last up to 2 hours, a little bit longer than originally planned, but I promise you that we have a full schedule with interesting speakers and presentations that will give us key insights in the topic of integrated coastal zone management. The topic of today cannot be overstated because it contributes to human and economic development, and it is vital for rich ecosystems. Let me demonstrate that with a few numbers. 70% of the world's population lives within 100 kilometers from the coast. Coastal ecosystems are central to a thriving humanity. And coastlines are also crucial for our global economy. 90% of the world's trade passes through coastal ports, and maritime trade volumes are set to triple by 2050. We know the climate crisis is threatening coastal areas around the world, so there is an urgent need for action. You might have expected a water expert to chair this meeting. However, I'm speaking to you, as Olivia said, as a young person who's passionate about taking climate action. So I know the picture painted looks bleak. However, I think also this webinar will present a strong call to action for all of us to continue working on adaptation and building resilience. And so I'm really delighted to have so many incredible speakers joining us from around the world, and we will hear about adaptation strategies that protect communities, restore ecosystems, and advance sustainable development. So without further ado, I will present to you the objectives of today's webinars. We are working together on co-creating knowledge of strong water climate adaptation strategies and practices in coastal areas. We will be engaging with experts in the field of coastal management and climate to learn about these good practices, and we are empowering other coastal regions to be ambitious and strategic when it comes to climate adaptation. We have, as mentioned, we have a full agenda for today. So we'll start with a short introduction to the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Areas. We will have 7 presentations followed by a Q&A panel. And you, our participants, are welcome to share your questions and remarks in the chat box. My colleague Olivia will be answering those. And then we will close with some updates and opportunities from GCA's water adaptation community. So we have a tight schedule. So my role as a chair today will also be to keep everybody on time. But I'm sure that won't be a problem. So without further ado, I would like to introduce my GCA colleague, Adam Baggy, who is Program Officer to the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Areas, to give us a brief overview of the IPDC. So Adam, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. It is with great pleasure that I stand before you today on behalf of the International Panel on Deltas and Coastal Areas, the IPDC. This groundbreaking initiative, supported by the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management, Deltares, and the Global Center on Adaptation, is dedicated to unlocking $5 billion worth of adaptation projects in 30 countries by 2030, ultimately benefiting the lives of 100 million people and their livelihoods. Facilitate IPDC as an international hub where countries are taking the lead in seeking and offering a wide range of recommendations and solutions, including delta management, coastal protection, island management, technical and governance solutions, and of course, access to finance. It fosters effective collaboration and interconnectivity between project initiatives and available financial assets. At IPDC, we embrace a multi-layered approach that encompasses political, scientific, and implementation levels. Through this approach, champion countries have the unique opportunity to mobilize both political will and financial resources, thereby ensuring that the voices of the water sector are heard loud and clear. I am also delighted to share that our esteemed members include Argentina, Colombia, Vietnam, Singapore, South Africa, Bangladesh, Egypt, Aruba, Curaçao, Sint Maarten, Bonaire, St. Eustatius, Saba, and the Asian Development Bank and the Green Climate Fund. As we embark on this webinar today, I am filled with optimism about the invaluable insights and the discussions that await us. Each speaker promises to be engaging, enlightening, and transformative. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for being a part of this event. Together, let us pave the way for a resilient future. Thanks.
Thank you, Adam, and I share your optimism. So thank you for providing that overview, and I look forward to following the IPDC's impact and adaptation accomplishments in the years to come. And I'm sure the speakers and participants share that feeling. So we will now move to the presentation section of this event. I would like to remind all the presenters that you will have a maximum of 10 minutes to present, and there will be time for Q&A in our panel discussion afterwards. So I would first like to welcome Mr. Arno Bouwman. Mr. Bouwman is the Deputy Project Leader for the Geography of Future Water Challenges at PBL, the Netherlands, which is the Dutch Environmental Assessment Agency. He studied human geography at Utrecht University, after which he started as a modeler at PBL, where he worked on integrated land use modeling for sustainable scenarios in the Netherlands. Then 10 years ago, Mr. Bouwman switched from national modeling to global modeling of floods with Gloveris. And last year, he, together with Willem Lichtvoet, who's the project lead, coordinated the Integrated Global Water Challenge research, which resulted in 2 publications of the Geography of Future Water Challenges. So very impressive overview of water challenges. So Mr. Bouwman, we look forward to your remarks, and over to you.
Thank you for having me. Welcome from the Netherlands. Good afternoon. I will share my screen now so we can start, because I only have got 10 minutes and I should use them well, I think. This one, you can see my screen now?
Yes,
okay.
We can see your screen.
Okay. In 2018, the PBL published the Geography of Future Water Challenges, which was indeed about water challenges. And in March this year, we published the Geography of Future Water Challenge, Bending the Trend, which is about solutions and a high ambition pathway, as we will see. This is the content of the book, and I will focus on part 2, exploring the future pathways, and especially on deltas and coast. As you can see, we depicted 4 hotspot landscapes: river basins, the deltas and coast, drylands, and cities. But I'm afraid I have to start with some sad messages based on a business as usual projection, because it's not looking good for the critical drivers for deltas. Based on climate change, change of river discharge regime will result in more droughts and higher flood peaks, acceleration by sea level rise. If that goes beyond 11 millimeter per year, then deltas are very much at risks. Subsidence is another problem, and it exceeds sea level rise in many deltas. So the relative sea level rise is even higher. Dams, they trap a lot of sediments, and there's no delta without sediment. Even so for urban construction, urbanization, which need a lot of sand and gravel to build. Sedimentation, accretion is no structural improvement, etc., etc. And the signs, the messages are not that good on mitigations. We won't deliver on the 2 degrees. And as IPDC stated in 2022, there are no signs yet of adequate adaptation responses, and spatial development still increase exposure. What we do in this second book, Bending the Trend, is explore, besides the business as usual scenarios, some ambitious pathways. And most important is a high ambition pathway in which you do everything you could based on a system approach, and where the sustainable development goals inspire development. We have 8 main water themes. I won't mention them all in my presentation. I just mentioned them here. We have items on water use and crop production, water pollution, nutrients, sanitation, of course, floodings from sea, dams, subsidence caused by groundwater abstraction, ecological quality based on nutrients. We have water in this chapter on water migration and conflict. And of course, we have water and climate resilient urban development as in the hotspot landscape on cities. Here again, the 4 hotspot landscapes. As I said, I will now focus on the deltas and coast, but deltas and coast, of course, are very, very much related to the upstream river basins, and of course the cities which they have in it. So let's start with the dams. There are lots and lots of dams planned, 3,700 for the coming years, and under a business as usual scenario, even more dams are planned. And as we see, they're mostly planned in the global south. And of course, dams have a negative impact on water dynamics, sediment flows as they trap sediment behind the dams, migration, ecological quality, because the natural flow of rivers is disturbed, and it can cause transboundary tensions, because water is kept behind for countries downstream, for instance. Under a high ambition, we assumed a standstill approach of dams. There will be no more large new dams, and new dams will be small scale hydropower facilities in which fish can travel, etc., etc. Just ecological friendly dams, and that is possible. Another issue, especially there where urbanization will grow very, very hard, like in South Asia and Africa, is that there will be need for lots of sediments in the form of sand and gravel for construction in urban areas. And as we see here, is that in the high ambition pathway, where we need another way of construction using less sand, it is possible to use very much less sand compared to the business as usual, which is the gray bar, and the high ambition pathway bar is the red bar. And especially in South Asia and Africa, there will be a lot of urbanization, so that we need new manners of construction, urban areas using less sand, based on nature-based solutions or something. There are solutions. Coastal flooding is also a very, let's say, impressive figures, because what we see in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, is that the population exposed to coastal flooding in a business as usual scenario explodes almost. And that's because of population growth, of course. And even on a global scale, the exposed population will grow enormously. Even under a high ambition scenario, it still will grow on a global scale, and especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and Asia. Cities, of course, are, because 2 billion people live in deltas and coastal zones, and majority lives in urban areas, in cities. And in that case, urbanization will go very rapidly, and especially, as you can see, in Africa, but especially in South Asia, where cities already contain a lot of people, but will grow enormously. For instance, Dhaka will grow from 21 million people in 2020 to almost 40 million people in 2070. So water and climate should be at any table regarding urbanization. And it's important, we think, that you look at the water and soil system as a whole, and it should be leading in planning new urban areas or reconstruction areas, because the geomorphology, the water and soil systems, have very low flexibility. And you should base your urbanization on that. You should keep attention to it. Whereas the urban area and houses are very flexible to adapt to climate change. And the underground, so to say, is less flexible, or not flexible at all, for adaptation. The hopeful thing is there are a lot of solutions, as you can see here. And again, water and soil systems should be leading in this map. You can say this image, and in the upside, you can again see the layer structure of buildings, neighborhoods, and the underground. And in this picture below, you see the water management options you have. So also in our book, we have the options on how to realize a high ambition pathway. Overall conclusions of our book is the high ambition pathway makes the difference. Flood risk, water use and subsidence can strongly be reduced. New dams can also be further decreased, or sedimentary flows can be halted. We did not see the nutrient emissions, but the pollution can be reduced, but not completely removed. But most of all, many measures have in a high ambition pathway have co-benefits for the SDGs, as you can see here. The above circle with the 17 SDGs is the results of a business as usual scenario in 2070. And the brownish color says it is not going well. And in the high ambition, you can gain a lot into the SDGs, because the blue colors are saying, okay, it's getting better. But the water sector cannot do this alone. You have to integrate sectors. And in the way forward, we write that we need radically different policies. And we depicted 3 focus areas: increase urgency, innovate approaches, and improve global governance. For instance, valuing water should be beyond economic efficiency, because water is at the center of everything, we think. And it's also, the urgency is now, so we have to think now. But we should think and plan beyond 2030. Yeah? We all know the SDGs are should be realized, which is not going to happen, I think, in 2030, but they have a value in it, which is for themselves valuable value, so to say. So we have to act now, because if we wait for the perfect knowledge and time, we will become specialists in waiting, and that's not what we want, I think. And I hope I've been in 10 minutes. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Baumann, for that overview. And thank you also for reminding us that the business as usual scenario just won't cut it, and that we need to place water at the heart of urban development, as well as that the sustainable development goals need to be leading for this most ambitious pathway. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there are questions that are coming up in the chat that we'll get to later also in our panel discussion. Then I warmly invite our next speaker, Ms. Michela Rambali, who's a policy analyst and advisor to the OECD. She's where she advises the head of climate, biodiversity and water division. And since joining the OECD in 2014, she's worked on a range of issues related to climate change, adaptation and mitigation, as well as on environmental performance and indicators. And Ms. Rambali now leads the work on measuring progress and implementing national adaptation policies. She has authored several reports, including on nature-based solutions, adaptation and mitigation linkages, as well as developed country reviews. Ms. Rambali, I warmly invite you to speak about the coordinated and adaptive policies that address coastal climate challenges. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'll share my screen. You should be seeing it in full mode. I'm delighted to be here today to share with you some of our work on climate resilience. I'm part of a broader team that has grown because the topic of adaptation has increasing caught the attention over the past few years. And as part of this, we've focused on better understanding climate risk. And so we've been focusing on specific climate risk, sea level rise in particular. Then we released last month a report on wildfires, and next we're going to look at drought. But so here I brought together some of the findings of our work on sea level rise. So the first slide really focuses on the importance of a coastal zone. And as the chair really highlighted some of these points already, I'm not going to go through it in much detail, but really wanted to highlight the importance of coastal zone as habitat, but also in providing valuable ecosystem services, be it for preventing extreme weather events, but also in protecting from extreme weather events, but also for carbon sequestration or biodiversity protection. They're also at the heart of for people, because that's where apparently the population density is actually 3 times higher on the coast than across the world. And there's 3/4 of the largest urban agglomeration that are already located in coastal areas. And they're also important for economic activities. I wanted also to remind the audience perhaps of the climate risk framework of the IPCC that brings together what determine the level of climate impact. So it's not just hazard level, but also exposure and vulnerability. Here on the hazard side, we know that sea level rise will intensify because of climate change, and Arnaud pointed to this in his presentation. There are some studies that show that over 300 million people will be affected in the future. The climate change will also increase ocean warming that will affect biodiversity across the coast, but also indirectly affecting coastal communities. There are also extreme storms that have already in the past caused a lot of damage, but will continue doing so in the future. On the vulnerability and exposure, there also the risk is increasing because people continue to live on the coast and increase with urban development that continue to increase. Urban development combined with land use change is also driving economic ecosystem losses, land subsidence and saline intrusion within the lands, and as well as water pollution. There are also exploitation of coastal resources that causes important environmental impact, and human activities that cause other environmental impact on the coast. So what can we do about it? And this is, we know that the risk is increasing, and we really need to make sure that the communities that are on the coast are better protected and can perhaps accommodate and use retreat strategy if needed when the time comes to better adapt to climate change in coastal zone management. It can be through protection. For example, we know that coastal ecosystem protection can actually reduce the damage caused by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. Here, I also wanted to highlight the use of nature-based solution that can significantly help reduce the flood damage, but also deliver other benefits, be it in terms of climate change mitigation or biodiversity or even economic benefits. In addition to protection, accommodate is another key area where there could be some more work that could be needed in terms of changing building codes. There are pros to doing so because it's more flexible than, for example, the retreat strategy, but it also helps raise awareness. For example, if you in Helsinki and in Christchurch, there are some examples where the cities have required higher levels of floors in buildings, but there are also, and the downside to this is that there are also uncertainties around the effectiveness over the long run, depending on the level of sea level rise. In terms of retreat, there are also some policy tools that exist, for example, through land use or zoning, that could bring some benefit, for example, in terms of creation of new habitat at the intersection between the sea and the coast. And it can also reduce the future cost of protection because there'll be fewer people and asset exposed. But there are, of course, difficult legal and political challenges in doing so. And here again, to highlight one statistic related to nature-based solution, there are an estimated already more than a third of people who are exposed to coastal flooding around the world that already benefit from nature-based solution. But so here I wanted to highlight some OECD practices that have been highlighted in the national adaptation plans of the countries to try and address this increasing risk from rising seas. The most obvious one is relates to information. We know that we need more information, and we need to better communicate this information around future flood risk to the people concerned. Most OECD countries already have developed their own national sea level rise projections, but we know that sea level rise remains one of the climate hazards that has most uncertainty around the timing and the magnitude of impacts. And it is still not widely established that countries combine their sea level rise projection with flood risk maps, but there are a few good examples, for example, from Ireland, where they combine information on sea level rise to their flood risk maps. It also not widespread yet that countries include their climate projection with and associate them with socioeconomic studies. There are more examples of this, for example, from Australia, the UK, France, or Netherlands that have developed studies to better understand how their own assets and vulnerability of their asset and people might be changing with sea level rise. The last point here is better communicating climate risk information and flood risk information to the people who are on the coast. Many countries have set up an information platform. Some have developed guidance for local governments for them to help implement action. There are also countries that have improved their early warning system. For example, Japan is a good practice in this case, but there's also Estonia or Mexico that have information 3 days ahead, depending to inform citizens around the wave heights. Then the second area relates more to policy instruments that are highlighted in the national adaptation plans. because we know sharing information is often not enough to incentivize action on reducing risks on the coast. So land use planning often actually rely on historical information, and so this is changing. And of course, Netherlands, Ireland, France already improving on this their land planning tools. Denmark also give the opportunity to municipalities to ban construction depending on different sea level rise scenarios. There are also important changes that are happening in building codes and infrastructure standard, where property developers or infrastructure provider can include safety margin when they construct dikes or seawalls. There also, we have many examples within OECD countries that are revising their standards, for example, from Denmark or Germany, to better integrate sea level rise. But there are different practices in terms of whether the standards are mandatory or just general guidance that many countries already provide. In terms of integrated zone management plans, a practice we see in the Mediterranean region, for example, in Spain and Portugal, we see that there are more and more mainstreaming of sea level rise in their plans, and this has proven to some extent effective to accelerate the implementation of adaptation measures. Another tool, and its effectiveness is also, there's a lot of studies on this, on its effectiveness, is risk-based flood insurance, to be able to transfer the risk across the community or public funders. And the advantage of this is, of course, that you involve stakeholders who are exposed, and so they might incentivize risk reduction behavior, but there are limited evidence around how much risk reduction behaviors they might take. This is an area where more work might be needed. Similarly, at the national level, there's also a lot of funding, national public funding schemes that are provided to encourage measures to reduce risks from coastal flooding. And now we're seeing that a lot of, most of it is under public funding schemes, but there are already some countries, for example, Finland, that are currently moving towards the private sector and making sure that the country and public funds remain here in the last resort. And the last point relates to property risk disclosure. This is not widely spread. This practice of encouraging countries to and buyers to have information on whether their houses or their asset might be exposed to sea level rise before they purchase the property is not a common practice, and when it's the case, it's rarely mandatory. But there are some subnational level examples, for example, in Australia or in California. So, despite the many examples of policy tools that are at the disposal of countries, we see that there remain challenges, and the risk is continuing to increase because of increasing exposure of assets and people. Remaining gaps in awareness about the level of risk. There are also misaligned incentives to reduce risks. For example, publicly subsidized flood insurance continue to provide subsidies to high-risk properties. And there are also some mismatch that exists between national funding, for example, for sea walls, while at the same time, local authorities might prefer to get a national funding for beach nourishment projects, as we've seen in certain cases, because it can provide, can help tourism. And at the same time, related to this, there are political economy challenges that arise from the different interests. Again, with this example of beach nourishment. It might be good for tourism, but there are consequences for biodiversity. And again, with this example is of beach nourishment, I wanted to highlight that it might be interesting. There were some studies that showed that it might be interesting to remove federal subsidies for beach nourishment. But at the same time, there would be a direct impact in removing these subsidies into the property value. And again, some taxes, local taxes are often based on property value. So there are incentives that need to be aligned to make sure that actors have the right tools to reduce their risks. And so to conclude, some points that we highlighted in our report was that we really need to engage stakeholders early in substance and making sure that they have access to up-to-date information. We need to better plan for the future and avoid any situation that would lock in future risks. Make sure that you align the different actors' responsibilities, resource, and incentives, because the allocation of risk and responsibility will have an impact on how they act. And finally, make sure to consider the distributional and equity implication of the policies that are implemented. And you'll find a reference to the examples I provided in the links on this slide. Thank you very much. Thank you. Still muted.
Aoife, you're
Sorry about that. Thank you so much, Ms. Morvelli, for sharing those good practices from different OECD countries, and for providing the insights that information and an enabling regulatory environment are really key to adaptation. So I'm now very pleased to invite our next speaker to the floor. That's Dr. John Kissey. He is the Chief Executive of the Ghana Hydrological Services Authority, who will present on climate risks and investment prioritization in Accra, Ghana. Dr. Kissey is an accomplished chartered civil engineer and multidisciplinary project director who has extensive experience in delivering successful infrastructure projects both in the UK and Ghana. And as acting CEO of Ghana Hydrological Authority, he ensures an organizational efficiency and oversees ongoing projects, promotes collaborations with local and international institutions. Dr. Kissey represents Ghana and Africa on the executive board of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure and is the country focal person for the implementation of the principles of resilient infrastructure under the UNDERR. He is the leading implementation of the flood mitigation component of Greater Accra Resilient and Integrated Development Projects. So that's a very impressive overview of your work, Dr. Kissey, and we look forward to hearing more from you. So over to you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the opportunity to share some of the work that we are doing with the GCN and with the other institutions. So I would go through briefly what a little bit of background to our institution. We'll talk about the coastal regions in Ghana. We'll look at some of the risks and challenges that we face, and some of the work that we've done in the past, and then we'll look at what we are looking to do in the future. So just a little background.
Sorry, we can't actually see your slides right now.
You can't?
No, it looks like we can see your.
It works for me.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Maybe I'm just having an issue here. Okay, apologies.
Okay, no problem. No problem at all. So right, so we say we Ghana Hydrological Authority until about a year ago. We were called Hydrological Services Department, and the government, recognizing the important role we have to play, decided to set us up as an authority under the Ghana Hydrological Authority Act 2022. So effective from September, we've been an authority. And our work, we have 5 main technical areas in our work: drainage and flood control, coastal protection, and we have applied and operational hydrology, land hydrographic survey, and then quantity survey. So this is just a little background of our organization. So talking about the coastal regions of Ghana, we have 16 regions in Ghana, and 4 of the regions lie along the coast. So our coastal regions include the Western region, the Central region, the Greater Accra region, and then the Volta region. And these are the towns that are in those regions. Time would not permit me to go into a lot more detail, but you could see with so many towns and cities in the coastal region, I'm sure we know it's estimated about 2/3, at least a third of the population will be in this community. And in this coastal area also, we have about 50 to 60%, that generates about 50 to 60% of the GDP for the country. So it's a very important area. So this map just shows the area in question, and I wouldn't say much about it. The Greater Accra region is of particular importance to this particular presentation, and I will say that shortly. So along in Ghana, we have 550-kilometer stretch of coastline. We have about 370 that are at risk of erosion, and mostly erosion, and then of course tidal flooding risk. We have so far protected about 80-kilometer stretch, and another 100-kilometer is mostly rocky and does not necessarily need protection, or is not under the risk of erosion. So now, looking at some of the challenges that we are faced with at the moment. Now, currently, the estimated cost of protecting a kilometer stretch of our coastline is $10 million. And we have at the moment about 370 that needs protection. So we're talking about a huge sum of money that at the moment we are not in a position to generate. And so we will have to manage the situation. And how do we manage? We have to manage with an early warning system. If we cannot protect people, at least we should be able to warn them if a tidal inundation is expected. And then our emergency response as well has to be spot on. We have been having a lot more, storm surges. We have been having a lot more challenges along the coast, properties being demolished and infrastructure being damaged as a result of tidal waves. And we have seen sea level rises. We'll see in a minute, how far our coastline has receded in the past couple of years, or in the past few years. Then we have a number of human activities along our coast that is also contributing to the coastal erosion. We have sand winning and other illegal activities. We have a challenge of really drawing people's attention to understand some of these issues and diseases from them. We have environmental degradation, mostly, rubber, the use of rubber, ending up along the coast and in the ocean, and also causing these environmental impact. So in terms of the challenge that we have, particularly in the Greater Accra region, but it's not limited to it. So I'll make reference to a particular incident in our country, which we would like to forget. That was in 2015, 3rd of June, 2015, where we had a high tide and coinciding with a big storm. The rivers overflowed the banks. The storm water could not be discharged into the sea, and we had backflow of water, which unfortunately mixed up with fire, and 152 people lost their lives. Damages were over $200 million, and it really did cost the economy a lot. So this shows the interaction really between what's happening along the coast and what's happening inland, and also the river. So we have been undertaking some works, this mostly by the coastal protection or coastal engineering arm of the authority, monitoring the coastline, investigating erosion issues, and designing and implementing coastal protection schemes. So I will, in a few seconds, just switch through some of the effort that we've made. Done some work in Axim, And sometimes we try and mix it up with also boosting the local economy. So in this case, for example, we provided what we call the breakwater to help, with the fishing activities along the coast as well. This was done in Axim. We've done the Sumansi Defense Project almost finished. Axim is finished. This one is almost finished as well. Anamabo project is almost 82% complete. And then we have Mina one, also 85% complete. Commander, about 95%. That is another one that we provided a fish market and also breakwater to also, boost local economic activities. So this is just give you a flavor of some of the work that we've done. Now, looking forward with the work that we're doing with GCA, it's focused mostly, it was focused on the Greater Accra metropolitan area. And this is got a stretch of 131 kilometer coastline. Some of these been protected, but majority of it is exposed. And why Greater Accra, and what are the vulnerabilities of the Greater Accra area? It's a low-lying area. We have seen a lot of variation in our rainfall pattern, high intensity rainfall. We have seen the sea level rising. We've seen the coastline receding, at an alarming rate, increasing incidence of tidal waves and storm surges that we have experienced. So now looking at the flood and erosion management issues. So we're looking at, inland flooding and how it also interacts with the, coastal area. We are looking at the issues we are projecting sea level rises, as we are all aware of, and how that is also going to be impacting, on our coastline and flooding challenges generally. So putting all of these together, we recognize the need to establish, a proactive and integrated approach to managing the flood hazards in the Greater Accra region and by extension, all the coastal areas in the country, if funding would allow. So with the climate change implications, I've already mentioned the sea level rises. I've also mentioned the variation in rainfall patterns and the high intensity rainfall. The impact has been, damage to critical infrastructure, to the disruption to transport and degradation to properties and structures. These have all been challenges that we've had, and we've had economic impact. I mentioned the impact of the 2015 event. Loss of livelihoods, loss of sources of income, and then the economic activities along the coast are all impacted, and the environment as well cannot be left out. So looking at where we are now and what is projected for the future. I mean, currently it's estimated that the sea level is rising around 3.3 millimeters per year. It's projected that by 2080 it will be around 35 mil if things progress the same way they are now. The coastline or the shoreline is expected to recede by about 52 meters by 2080, and but historically it's been at around 1.1 meter per year. So really, it's going to be increasing, and something definitely has to be done. The government recognizes this challenge, and in the government's national development, medium-term plan, it's recognized that we have to improve coastal and marine management. So what are we doing? I mentioned earlier that we are working with various institutions in this area of work. So we've got GARID. GARID is focused on a catchment in Greater Accra region. And the picture that I showed you, the 2015 area where we had the coastal inundation mixed up with surface water and riverine flooding. That is where the GARID is focused on. We're also working with the Africa Development Bank on the what we call a gas slip project. And currently we are engaging the World Bank on the West Africa Coastal Area Resilience Investment Program. We call it WACA. That is all the countries along the West Africa coast participating in that program, focusing on policies, that would secure the coastal area, that will also tackle environmental challenges along the coastal area, and also, prevention of erosion and protection of the coastline. We are also engaging the WMO, talking about the West Africa Coastal Inundation Forecasting Initiative, an early warning system that would serve the whole of the Western African coastal area. And that is work that we are doing with WMO. And then we are at the very early stages of engaging the Dutch Water Board or the Dutch government on the Ghana Deltas program. These are just a few of the projects that have been identified on the work that we're doing with the GCA. Time will not permit me to go into a lot more detail, but I'll focus on the coastal area protection. We are aspiring, working with GCA and hopefully with other partners, we are aspiring to protect about 75 kilometers of the coastline, and at a cost of about 156 million, and that would protect or provide benefit to 2.3 million people in the Greater Accra metropolitan area. Then we are also looking at the flood management, flood forecasting and management, and early warning system that is part of the initiatives or part of the projects we want to implement, aspiring to implement, at a cost of 12.9 million. Again, that will protect or provide benefit to about 2.3 million people in the Gama area, and which also meet some SDG objectives, or we'll take some boxes under the SDG, which will not go into much detail on. So in conclusion, what we are trying to do really is to enhance resilience and reduce vulnerability to climate change, protect our vulnerable communities, protect our critical infrastructure, and to build the capacity of the Ghana Hydrological Authority to be able to maintain this infrastructure once they are in, and also to be able to keep the country resilient and our communities protected. Thank you very much for the opportunity once again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kissy, for outlining that, as you said, proactive and integrated approach to coastal management, and also for outlining the good practices that you're undertaking in Accra, Ghana. And I particularly liked the example you gave about how you're combining coastal protection with boosting the local economy. So thank you for that. I invite our next speaker to the floor. Our next speaker is Mr. Chang Chen Wu. He is here to share about, he will share about Singapore's approach to coastal protection. He's a consultant to the Singapore Coastal Protection Department, and he supports the department in the formulation of policies, strategies, and guidelines to guide adaptation planning and the implementation tailored for Singapore's diverse and urban setting. And he also supports the development of initiatives and research to build local capacities in the coastal protection sector. He graduated with a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from the National University of Singapore and holds a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering, also from the National University of Singapore. So with that, over to you, Mr. Chang.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. A very good day to all of you. I'm Chen Wei from the Coastal Protection Department, or PUB, which is the National Water Agency of Singapore. It is my privilege to share with you Singapore's approach to the integrated management of its coastlines to address the challenge of climate change. For those of you who are not familiar, Singapore is a small island state located in Southeast Asia off the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula and about 100 kilometers north of the equator. Sea level rise is an existential threat for Singapore. About 30% of our land area is less than 5 meters above the mean sea level, and sea levels can reach 4 to 5 meters, taking into account extreme high tide, storm surge, and sea level rise. But with only 700 square kilometers of land and home to more than 5 million people, We cannot retreat or relocate from the rising sea levels. And furthermore, we are very near the equators. Therefore, we frequently experience very intense tropical convective rains, which we expect to increase with climate change. Singapore is treating climate change defensive with utmost seriousness. This was underscored by our Prime Minister in his 2019 National Day rally. Then PUB was then appointed in 2020 as the National Coastal Protection Agency to lead and coordinate whole-of-nation efforts to protect Singapore from rising sea level. Now, as you can see, we are a very young coastal protection agency of only 3 years. Nevertheless, coastal protection is one of Singapore's key strategies to build a resilient future under the Singapore Green Plan 2030. Now, our objectives and strategies. As a national coastal protection agencies, we are committed to keep our shores dry, our people safe in the face of rising sea levels. Our aim is to prevent the loss of lives, protect assets and infrastructure which we have built up over the past decades, and to ensure that we can continue to use our land in the future. And to do that, we plan to build a continuous line of defense around Singapore to keep up the rising sea levels. We strengthen protection of our critical infrastructure to ensure that essential services are not disrupted during extreme flood events, and also implement the source pathway and receptor approach to manage excess stormwater. Coastal protection is an opportunity as much as it is a challenge. Now, this slide summarizes our approach towards coastal protection. 1, we will take a holistic risk assessment approach to understand the threat of rising sea levels. 2, we will adopt a flexible and adaptive approach to implement coastal protection measures to address uncertainties in sea level rise projections. 3, we will implement integrated planning to achieve value and multiple benefits beyond coastal protection. 4, we will stage the implementation of coastal protection measures in order to avoid punching out of resources. 5, we will build expertise and capabilities to support this long-term mission. And last but not least, we do not intend to do this alone, but we will bring everyone from the agencies, the universities, the private sector, then the community and all stakeholders on board to contribute to this national agenda. Now, I will take the next few slides to elaborate further on each of these approaches. Holistic risk assessment. With climate change and the threat of rising sea levels, we will need to manage both inland and coastal flood risk in a holistic manner. Now, PUB is developing a coastal inland flood model that will simulate the combined effects of inland and coastal flooding. The integrated model will allow us to evaluate flood risks and the effectiveness of our coastal and flood protection measures based on the latest climate science. At the same time, we are also building up predictive capability to provide advanced warning of extreme coastal events to enhance our operational and emergency responses. A flexible and adaptive approach to deal with uncertainties of sea level rise projections. We adopt a flexible and adaptive approach when implementing coastal protection measures. So instead of an ultimate level of protection for coastal protection measures, we will instead develop adaptation pathways that will chart out measures and pathways that offer future implementation options. This approach supports near-term decision-making to do no regrets and first few interventions, while allowing us to build higher in the future when needed. At the same time, we will undertake systematic monitoring of the actual sea level rise to focus on the next course of action in the future, i.e. whether we should hold on to the development or we should build higher. This is important as climate change is a long-term undertaking. Integrated planning, but Singapore is small. Our coastal areas are highly varied in terms of land use. This means that we cannot apply a one-size-fits-all solution for coastal protection. Coastal protection solution will therefore be customized based on the unique characteristics and constraints of each site. Hence, our approach is to work closely with agencies, with fellow agencies that oversee land use, transport, parks, and nature to adopt integrated planning so as to achieve multifunctional solutions that can deliver value and co-benefits beyond coastal protection. We will therefore look for opportunities to complement existing or to dovetail future land use, provide new recreational and community spaces, create new functions like building a freshwater reservoir, or to integrate nature with our coastal protection structures. 4. Phased implementation. Now, coastal adaptation will be a costly endeavor. Hence, our fourth approach is to stage development plans to progressively implement construction works. This is critical to avoid bunching out of resources so that we can continue with our coastal protection efforts sustainably in the decades ahead. To do so, we have divided Singapore's coastline into 8 different segments. The area within each segment is hydraulically connected up to a certain level, and measures forming a continuous line of defense for that segment will be required to protect the entire region from coastal flood risk. In terms of phasing, we have prioritized segments that are more vulnerable to flood risk and where more critical infrastructures are located. Capability building. Coastal protection is considered a new area for Singapore, and as such, we recognize the importance of building expertise and long-term capability. New challenges requires new knowledge, new technology, and new solutions. Earlier this year, we launched a 125 million research program for coastal protection and flood management. Now, the aim of this program is to collaborate with research institutes and the industry, both locally and globally, to one, drive the development and application of effective and smart solutions. 2, catalyze the growth of the local R&D ecosystem. And 3, facilitate the translation and the commercialization of solutions. But last but not least, coastal protection is a shared responsibility. We must bring everybody on board to contribute to this national agenda to help people understand the impacts of sea level rise and the need for urgent action. We have rolled out a series of education programs to raise awareness. They include lighthearted edutainment videos, documentaries. In addition, we have also conducted community dialogue sessions with stakeholders so that Singaporeans can actively participate in the solutioning process and better appreciate the challenges, trade-offs, as well as opportunities that come with different solutions. Building community resilience is key, and it is not possible to remove flood risk completely. Now, to summarize, climate adaptation is a long-term endeavor and requires a whole-of-nation efforts, a whole-of-nation approach. The Singapore's government approach is to lead, coordinate, integrate, and drive coastal protection works. Work with the local and international experts and institutes of higher learning to build capability and expertise. Develop new innovative solutions through research and collaboration with the private sector, and involve the community and all stakeholders to provide constructive feedback, co-create solutions, and support coastal protection endeavor to ensure that the country will be protected from the threats of sea level rise now and for generations to come. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Chang, for that very insightful presentation. And I like what you said about coastal protection is a shared responsibility, and for outlining how the government of Singapore is bringing in different stakeholders to work on integrated coastal management. Then from Singapore, the government of Singapore, we go to the private sector. So I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. George Peters, who is the Climate Resilience Global Leading Market Director with Royal Haskoning DHV, who will present on coastal resilience in Beira, Tacloban, and Sunderban. Mr. Peters brings over 28 years of experience in the design of dikes, dams, and flood risk reduction projects worldwide. And in his role as Global Director, Mr. Peters works together with almost 1,000 colleagues worldwide on creating a safe, healthy, and climate resilient environment for people and society. Also, Mr. Peters has worked on behalf of the Dutch government with their DRR team as the leader for projects in Tacloban, Paulo, and Catanduanes in the Philippines, and more recently in the Sundarbans of India. So without further ado, over to you, Mr. Peters.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll share my screen. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet.
Not yet. Sorry for this.
Yes, we can see it.
Very good. Very good. Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for the invite to share some of our project examples and experiences. I quickly introduce myself and the company. You'll see in the next slides that coastal resilience is in the heart and mind of me and my fellow colleagues. Working with Royal Hospitalities for a long time. Our company goes back way earlier. We started 142 years ago. We are employee-owned company. We are independent international consultancy, engineering and technology firm. We show leadership and sustainability innovation by combining global expertise and local knowledge and network. Our mission is to enhance society together. I've selected 3 projects to highlight and to share some of my experiences on coastal resilience projects. On the left, you see the map of Mozambique, of Beira. Following the disastrous cyclone Idai, back in 2019, the coastal protection plan has been developed for the area. In this plan, different measures were identified, providing protection to the people, the businesses, reducing economic damage to the area. In the center, you'll see the map of India, of the Sundarbans. And during the last typhoon Amphan, the existing diking system in the Sundarban got breached at over 700 locations. Land flooded, causing major disruptions, damage to people and their livelihoods. The aim of the government of West Bengal is to develop a holistic and inclusive plan. And we supported them in these activities. I'm going to tell a bit more about that later. On the right side of the screen, you'll see the map of Tacloban of the Philippines. The area around Tacloban and Palau gets hit by typhoons 20 times a year. The challenge, our assignment, was to prepare a sustainable coastal protection strategy for the area, providing a safe future for the people living there. We started Beira at Mozambique. The objective of our project, of our assignment in Beira, on which we work together with a number of partners, was to achieve a higher level of safety for the area and actually take into account the challenges of climate change. By integrating flood safety, erosion protection into the urban and natural environment of the city. Integration with the current layout and future plans was key to success. There were so many different stakeholders involved. The existing line of defense, of protection, is built from dunes along the northern stretches of the city, connecting to the old seawall in the center, protecting beaches by grounds, by sand, dunes, combined with urban outlet structures for the internal drainage system. And the main goal of the project was to actually deliver a flood protection strategy for the city of Beira, protecting the city from a 150-year event in 2070. Looking ahead, that's the long-term vision. There were a number of challenges in the area. The flood-prone area on the north, that's the port area, but it's under development. It's not known at the moment. So how do we prevent backdoor flooding to the city center? That was one of the challenges. The Praia Nova in the center is the new city. It's low-lying, but it's a dynamic heart. It's the bouncing heart of the city of Beira. Protection is not enough. The disruption should be minimal. So how do we protect there? That was quite a challenge. And the existing dune ridge on the right side, on the eastern side of the city, was not sufficiently high, not sufficiently wide, but it was deconnection from the people in the city towards the sea. So how can we keep the one and protect the other? That was a challenge on itself. We investigated and quantified flood and erosion hazards. We came up with risks. We investigated and discussed thoroughly with all the stakeholders involved the land development plans, and even more importantly, for the city of Beira and the ambitions for urban redevelopment. At the same time, an event larger than 1 in a 50-year can happen every year. And even though it's rare, the area and its people behind the line of defenses need to be prepared. So how do we include a kind of a multi-level safety approach for the city? Operation and maintenance proved to be a challenge. And the institutional setting in and around Beira, in terms of roles and responsibilities, made this aspect fairly complex. We didn't want to rely on hard engineering solutions alone, so we thoroughly investigated the use of nature-based solutions in terms of mangrove restorations and sand nourishments from deep sea. At the end, we come up with a plan, with a tailor-made solution for every stretch of the line of defense. Second project I would like to highlight, the second example, is about the Sundarbans in India. A key to ensuring water safety, water security for the area is by stepping up coastal resilience. It's about creating freshwater environment on the islands and restoration and protective coastline towards the sea. Keywords of the approach that we chose, it should be holistic. It should be inclusive of delta development. It's about how to future-proof the area, but also looking to the bigger picture. We've developed different strategies, adaptive strategies for the longer term, and we also came up with a short list of no-regret measures for the short term. The ambition of the state government of West Bengal was really to have an overarching, holistic plan for the area. But where do you start? The challenges are huge. The strong, often realigned embankments need to be there. Sea dikes are needed. But more importantly, some tough decisions have to be made. Where to live, where to work. The challenges, the uncertainties are simply too big in this part of the world. They cannot have it all. We need to choose, and we assisted them in that decision-making process. At a balance between the international best practices and local environmental social impacts and needs were very much decisive during the stakeholder processes. There were also some political drivers. The first priority of the team, was to really understand the complexity, the bigger picture, and to move on based on the risk-based approach, simply because we have to choose where to play. We have to make it visible, we have to do the number crunching, we have to do the river system, the delta dynamics, the land use, the livelihoods of the people, and all that combined actually yielded in a picture for the short and the longer term. This visual, what we actually delivered as one of the recommendations from the plan, provides an overview of all the recommended steps. Ultimately, we want to grow to a sustainable and safe delta. That goes hand in hand with improved knowledge of the local stakeholders and the owners. We have to focus on the no-regret actions, and at the same time, we have to support capacity building and monitoring. So at the end, the bigger plan in place, combined with concrete, no-regret actions and quick wins for the intermediate time, did work very well. Third and final example, what I would like to share with all of you is about Tacloban and Palau in the Philippines. And as said, the area in the Philippines get hit by 20 typhoons on average on an annual basis. On November 2013, the largest typhoon ever recorded, Yolanda, hit the province of Leyte. Wind speeds up to 330 kilometers per hour, a storm surge of over 6 meters, that really destroyed the area. Okay. The city centers on the eastern side of the island were hit hardest, with some residential areas completely washed out. Flooding extended 1 kilometer inland along the east coast of the province. And the challenge of our assignment was to prepare a sustainable coastal protection strategy. And the strategy must guarantee Tacloban's future, Palau's safety, and also includes items for the attractiveness as well as the livelihoods of the people residing and working along the coast. It's all about future-proofing the area, providing a safe, prosperous place for the people and the environment. It was a multidisciplinary challenge, every step of the journey. Stakeholder sessions, household surveys, legislational aspects, understanding hazards, calculating risks, creating awareness, capacity building, crunching the engineering. So we had all options on the table. The result was the outcome. of a locally supported plan, a long-term vision, us moving forward. Large stakeholder participation processes were in place, making sure all interests were taken on board. And the preferred strategy for Taklaba and Palau, it combines soft and hard measures. Funding options have been explored, arriving at both technical, environmental, and financially, economically interesting alternatives. And at the end, it was a political decision on how to move forward. The lessons learned I would like to share with all of you from these projects and other projects we've carried out over the past years. I've selected 10. And the first one, future-proof, scenario thinking, adaptive pathways. Let's keep it transparent. It's all about ownership. Ownership with the decision makers, ownership with the client and the partners and the local stakeholders. It needs to be in the heart and mind of the people. The second one on the measures and the maintenance, it's all about roles and responsibilities. That needs to be properly organized. Who has which role, who has what responsibility. The third one is about uncertainties. There's a lot we don't know, but still we need to move forward in terms of coastal resilience. So how do we deal, how we talk, how we discuss about uncertainties? The fourth one, about the life cycle approach, that's very much about the bigger picture. Coastal resilience is thinking about the bigger picture, and at the same time, start in the meantime. The fifth one is about monetizing, and then it becomes a bit complex, and because not all benefits from coastal resilience are equally tangible. The challenge is to happen over conversation and to make progress. Timing is important. Some of our projects got seriously hampered by political events, by political decisions, by elections. That doesn't speed up the process. Most of the times, it actually creates a kind of a standstill. Succession planning also closely relates to ownership, especially when you look at longer-term commitments, long-term projections. Ownership in the organizations, in the different authorities is key. Pilot projects on number 8, it's about quick wins, and it helps when we're working on coastal resilient projects that there is visibility at the start. So we're not only making plans, doing the calculations, making the drafts, but we also have visibility to actually test to see if things work. The blueprint for coastal resilience in the Philippines, that's one of the spin-offs from the project in the Tacloban and Palau. And the methodology that we actually developed really helped the Philippine Reclamation Authority to roll out their plans and ambitions for the eastern coast of the Philippines. 10th, the roadmap is really about having a proper balance between the short and the longer term. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Peters, for this insightful case studies from around the world. And I liked how you also spoke about how you kind of brought together the international best practices with the local context and how that can also inspire other projects around the world. So thank you very much for your remarks. And then I will invite our next speaker to the stage. Our next speaker is Ms. Joanna Acom. Ms. Joanna Acom is the Managing Director of Climate Resilient Infrastructure. Her work focuses on the use and value of natural infrastructure to mitigate and reduce climate risk, to take flood reduction measures, coastal erosion, and wildfire. This week, Canada brought out their first national adaptation strategy that Ms. Acom was a part of. She contributed as a member of the Resilient Built and Natural Infrastructure Advisory Table. So also very much looking forward to hearing more on that. Over to you, Ms. Acom.
Thank you so much. Okay, hopefully you can see my slides now. So I'm happy to present to everybody today. I've been sitting through the different perspectives from different countries, so hopefully I can provide a Canadian perspective and be happy to answer any questions on that. So a quick outline of what I'm going to go through is, what the situation is in Canada in terms of coastal communities and climate change, the status particularly of integrated coastal zone management here in this country, and some recent initiatives that are moving in the right direction. So just a brief word on the Intech Centre on Climate Adaptation in case people are not familiar with what we do. So we have a national focus. We're based in Ontario, but we work from coast to coast to coast in Canada, and we have bilingual resources because we also work in Quebec, which is a francophone province. So our goal is to make sure that adaptation is fully addressed in the conversation around climate change in Canada, and to help residents, communities, governments, and businesses address climate adaptation through practical action on the ground. So in terms of the coasts in Canada, so we have 3 marine coasts, and we also have the Great Lakes. So in the marine coast, we're facing relative sea level change, particularly on the east and west coast. You can see on the map, the red dots are the kind of it's a rainbow. So the red dots are higher, up to a 1 meter sea level rise that we're expecting by the end of the century. With that comes increased storm surge, but also changing sea ice conditions, which may be something that others on this call are not dealing with, but basically sea ice is protecting our coasts in many ways, and actually the reduction of sea ice is leading to increased coastal erosion in some places. On the Great Lakes, we're coping with more extreme variations in water level. So obviously this is not tidal, but it behaves in many sense. The coastal processes are kind of similar, but we're obviously dealing with not tides, but extreme water levels. So extremely high and extremely low. The frequency and intensity of severe storms is already increased in the Great Lakes region. And obviously, so we're dealing with extremes, severe storms, flooding, erosion, but also sewage overflow and interference with transportation and flood damage. It's not just an environmental issue for Canada. So this is the catastrophic losses in Canada over the last, since 82, I think it is. Basically, we're seeing a rise in insured losses. This is just what's insured. So a normal year is now about $2 billion in insured losses in Canada, 3.1 billion years last year. And that's just what's insured. So it's estimated that what is not insured that is paid by governments, individuals, and businesses about 3 to 4 times this. So the price tag and the financial implication of climate change and climate risk is really ramping up in Canada. And obviously, this doesn't include health, even fatalities due to extreme heat, for example. So it really is a key financial and health issue. What's just one example was Hurricane Fiona in last year in September, which actually was responsible for $800 million in insured damages. Oh, again, that's just what's insured. But more than like 80% of Nova Scotia and 95% of Prince Edward Island were without power. So, you know, significant impacts. So the way the Intech Centre works, we look at different, I called it adaptation, just because we're completely focused on practical solutions. It's required at different scales. So from the individual to buildings to communities, but all the way up to the coastal cell. And I particularly want to kind of focus at the coastal cell level because we're talking about integrated coastal zone management. So if we're going to implement nature-based solutions, we do need to be working at a scale of natural systems. And that's where guidance, I would say, is more emergent in Canada. We're not kind of routinely managing our coasts on the scale of literal cells, but we do have quite solid guidance at the community building and individual levels. So this is my my poster picture of what this is not the answer. So this is Prince Edward Island, and actually this project sparked a moratorium in Prince Edward Island and until a coastal zone policy is developed that looks at more strategic approach. So this is not what we want to see anymore, but it has still happened up to recent times here in Canada. So we don't have good integrated coastal zone management as yet, but we're working on it. So as was mentioned at the beginning, a national adaptation strategy was launched this week. So there are specific quantified targets with time deadlines in them, which I think is pretty innovative on a national scale. So by 2027, the target is that 80% of coastal communities and 60% of businesses located in coastal regions are implementing adaptation actions. So that's not just plans, it's actually the actions. So that's something that we will be looking to as we've got, 4 years left now. So that's a key impetus for us. And there is a new coastal resilient coastal communities program that was announced with the National Adaptation Strategy, which is specifically to increase the resilience of communities by new systems-based approaches to integrated regional scale projects. So we're very excited to work with Natural Resources Canada on that initiative, which sounds like it's going to do good things. Just a little on what is going on in terms of strategic coastal management initiatives. The Intech Centre is very pleased to be part of the Coastal Resilience Framework for the Canadian Great Lakes, which is it's a bit of a think tank between federal and provincial government representatives across different departments that are looking to establish a resilience framework, mainly focused on Lake Erie, which has specific coastal erosion issues as a case study. And we're looking at how integrated littoral cell resilience planning could work for Lake Erie in the context of maybe a wider lake plan as well. So that's something that is ongoing at present. And I put the website address if people want to follow up and find out more about that. There's also, we've just literally in the last couple of weeks launched with Standards Council of Canada, a shoreline management planning national guidance project that we will be developing over the next year. Not a simple task, particularly because of jurisdictional responsibilities between the federal government in Canada, but actually a lot of the coastal management is actually a provincial responsibility. So we have different approaches being adopted by different provinces. So this is a key challenge for us in Canada here. At the same time, we have rapidly evolving guidance, particularly on nature-based solutions and how we can use nature-based solutions with grey solutions. So this is just a bit of a snapshot of since, I think, 2021. So some of our researchers contributed to the international guidance on natural and nature-based features for flood and erosion. There was a state of play on where we're at with nature-based solutions done by the Canadian Standards Association. We looked at rising seas and shifting sands, looked at combining natural and grey infrastructure solutions and how nature-based solutions can kind of contribute to protection and retreat solutions in a more strategic way. Maybe that's slightly different. We are looking at integrating natural assets into asset management planning. And I think the previous speaker mentioned the value of nature-based solutions. So this is specifically to tackle, identifying what the level of services provided by natural assets and what their value is and how they need to be managed in the long term by local governments. And we're also looking at extreme heat because this is a rising risk in Canada. So, coastal, we're focused often on flood and erosion, but heat is coming for us in Canada. And Vancouver was a key example. The heat dome is something that we need to consider in our projects. Also, coming soon is a guide from the National Research Council of Canada on nature-based infrastructure for coastal zone resilience. And I mention this really because there are key sections on a systems approach, governance, and engagement of different rights and stakeholders. So I think that is a key thing for us here. Just a quick case study of how strategic cost-benefit analysis has been kind of used to drive strategic option decisions. So this is PERCE in Quebec, which is a study that was done in by Uranus in 2016, which basically took a more inclusive look at the costs and benefits of different coastal management strategies. And over a 50-year period, the preferred solution of beach nourishment, which was a more natural solution, actually had a cost-benefit ratio of 68:1. And I think, large benefits from the tourist industry. And I think, this demonstrates that the benefits do stack up when we take all the benefits into account. There's also examples of communities already working strategically together, despite kind of having this kind of routine integrated framework. So this is Mud Bay Nature-Based Foreshore Enhancements Project, which is a partnership between the City of Surrey, the City of Delta, and the Semiahmoo First Nation, which aims to implement a living dike solution, but really is a great example of how communities have come together to try and adopt a more strategic approach. And I'd like to draw attention as well in that way to the Sea to City project in Vancouver in False Creek, which really worked with host nations to develop a different terminology of talking about our approaches to coastal protection or coastal, I'm using the same words, but basically looking at people and nature as one, and not in like this kind of antagonistic manner of fighting against nature. So rather than resist, accommodate, or move, talking more about restore, acknowledge, and host, seeing kind of restoration of people and nature at the same time, rather than this kind of, keep nature away and natural processes being an issue that we need to avoid. So that was an interesting looking at how language influences design. So quite rapidly, some key conclusions. I've actually only got 3, so even more rapidly. So coastal communities are on the front lines of climate change in Canada, and federal, provincial, and local governments really need to work together, and that has hindered us in getting a kind of routine strategic approach to coastal management. But there are several initiatives that are working in the right direction at the moment, and it's something that the Intech Centre is very keen to see develop and kind of get this, see what we can do in a more strategic manner rather than a patchwork of solutions. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Aiken, for sharing those best practices from Canada. And thank you also for reminding us that we should see people and nature as one, and sharing the power of nature-based solutions with us. I'm very pleased to invite our final speaker to the floor, Mr. Matthijs Bouw, who will speak to us about the Big U project in New York City. Matthijs Bouw is the Dutch founder of an award-winning Amsterdam and New York-based firm, the One Architecture and Urbanism, known as One. He directs the Urban Resilience Certificate Program at the Weizmann School of Design, where he is also a professor of practice. He's a fellow at the McHarg Center for Risk and Resilience, and he's a fellow at the Institute of Urban Research. So thank you so much for taking the time for being with us today, Mr. Bouw, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and I'll share my screen. It's exciting to hear about the Sea to City competition. I co-led a team there, and it was really mind-blowing to sort of start to think together with the First Nation people of how you can rethink your language around these type of processes. Today, I'll talk about our work in Manhattan and sort of give a sort of context of what we've been able to achieve with all the different partners over the last almost decade now, the decade since Superstorm Sandy that blacked out much of New York, that caused incredible damage, and was really a wake-up call for the city to start acting on the threats of coastal storms, sea level rise, and other climate impacts. And one of the things that people started to recognize for the first time, others of course knew, but in general, people recognized for the first time how much of Lower Manhattan was in the flood zone. Part of that, of course, has to do with land reclamation over time, as in many cities and many coasts, because of industries, port developments, residential developments. The land has been expanded, basically creating large vulnerable areas. And in New York, the way to deal with that in the immediate aftermath was a plan called the SIRR plan, in which sort of looked at a lot of different measures to increase the resilience of Lower Manhattan. It was clear that one-for-all solutions like storm surge barriers were not a good strategy, but that really building resilience would require a more adaptive approach in which a lot of different actions would be building on top of each other. But one of the things that was formulated and that took our interest in a competition that was organized right after Superstorm Sandy, with some federal money at the back end of it, was that for Lower Manhattan, there was an idea of an integrated flood protection system, fundamentally for the 8 continuous miles of the coastline that was at risk. And our thought as designers was, how do you do that? This city, with the transition of the ports to more residential areas and to public waterfronts, has sort of reestablished the connection with the waterfront. In New York, there's no coastal protection system in place, and we would not want a sort of new coastal protection system that would sort of disconnect the city from its waterfront, but also temporary measures at the scale that would be needed in Manhattan would not make a lot of sense. Too risky, too much maintenance. I mean, it's not for nothing that Angela Merkel looks so grumpy in this image. And so when thinking about how to design that, we took our cue from the High Line, with the idea that you can think of infrastructure, in this case, an abandoned infrastructure, also as a social infrastructure, as a public amenity. And so our ideas was to say, maybe we can start to think about how to program infrastructure to make it more about people, and to start to think about a resilience infrastructure that is also a social infrastructure. And that what caused for us an idea of the big U that we developed together with a lot of different actors and stakeholders in a host of different sessions. And the idea there was then, rather than having one big piece of infrastructure, you should really be making a sort of necklace of local flood protection infrastructures that each have independent utility, and that each can be sort of addressing all the local challenges in the local communities. And these are some images of the original vision that we had, where you could integrate your levees into parks, or even into buildings. And this is a well-known image that I imagine many of you know. And the secret, I think, of this big U was really that it was this set of smaller U's, which made it possible to start to develop projects one at a time. And the first project that was being developed, and this is an image from an exhibition, which shows how far ahead we are now with these project development. But the first project that was being developed was a project called the Eastside Coastal Resiliency, which is a project for about 2.8 miles, about 4 kilometers of coastline, largely coinciding with a park, largely protecting a vulnerable population living in public housing along the eastern side of Manhattan. That project is now under construction. These are some of the images. It consists at some areas of flood walls. There are large gates being installed to maintain at many moments the connections between the city and the waterfront. And we are constructing, even in these very constrained environments, parks and public amenities on this waterfront, as well as better bicycle connections, etc. The sort of second project that came out of that was the Lower Manhattan Coastal Resiliency Project. And there we realized that where the Eastside Coastal Resiliency Project is designed to withstand significant floods in around 2050 at the required level of protection, we realized that in the longer term, in Lower Manhattan, we would not only have to address storm surge, but we would also have to address tidal flooding, regular inundation of what is really the financial heart of maybe the world, as well as a whole host of issues in the subsoil. And for that, we realized that where possible, we needed a different type of projects. We needed, on the one hand, projects that were a bit more temporary. This is the Brooklyn Montgomery Coastal Resiliency Project that is now also under construction, that is built under the highway. That is a combination of a sort of 3 feet elevation, as you see here, integrated with all the urban furniture to keep out tidal flooding and smaller storms, and then flip up deployables in between these concrete elements that protect against bigger storm surge, for which we are designed the architecture. And so what you can see here is in this image to the left, you can see those flip up deployables sort of embedded in the infrastructure of the benches that is being designed there now. But while that project is being planned at the under a highway whose future in itself is uncertain, there's another project further to the south that we're developing where we are realizing that intervening and building a coastal protection system in that very constrained urban environment is such a huge effort that we should not build this within a sort of life cycle for maybe 50 years in the worst case scenarios, or in more likely cases about 75 to 80 years, but that we should also be looking at much longer term sea level rise and storms. So this is the area in Lower Manhattan for the seaport and the financial district, where you have all these different subways, where you have a very highly dense urban fabric. And our question was, how do we fit in a coastal protection system there at a sort of much higher elevation than these other systems, target elevation of up to 25 feet, with a baseline elevation of another 4 feet to make sure that we keep the tidal flooding out as well. And so there is a fully passive system of flood protection against tidal flooding and smaller storm surge events, and then a sort of more active with openable elements so that we can maintain the connection with the waterfront that can be closed in case of potential big storms approaching against storm surge. And so this is what that project is starting to look like now. We are really creating a sort of multi-level waterfront with, as we are starting to learn more about the importance of urban heat and biodiversity, with a lot of sort of semi-nature-based features in there. And this multi-level waterfront can protect against both tidal flooding and storm surge well into the next century. And so these are some impressions of that work. We are now bringing that into design, and in that we of course had to look very carefully at what are and study what are the sort of different approaches to a coastal protection system. You see in our evaluation that the approaches on the left we felt would not really work. So we try to really think like, what can we do, even building some additional land in there to get this coastal protection system in place. We have to, of course, solve, that's what Mr. Chang said in Singapore, a lot of very complex technical problems of building these type of infrastructures in these dense environments, and really add to that a very sophisticated landscape architecture and urban design to make sure that this waterfront becomes an even better place than it is now for tourists and residents alike. In that, we also have to completely rethink the transportation infrastructure as well as the entire ferry infrastructure, because all of that will be part of the rising sea level. This is not an easy project. In the United States, there's a lot of challenges around environmental reviews, permitting, and approvals, but we're slowly bringing this design forward with the hope of starting construction about 5 to 7 years from now, and really making sure that we have a very continuous process of community engagement on these type of projects. This is a vision. Now you start to see how we are integrating this infrastructure into the city, but we're also very much integrating this planning process into the people of the city, working with them to help understand what is happening, build capacity for stewardship, because I think that is really equally critical than finding the right technical solutions. I think I'm at the end. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for having me here.
Thank you, Mr. Rao, for your presentation and for highlighting that it's long-term thinking that we need for coastal protection, and not thinking only into the next decade, but also into the next century. So thank you for those remarks. Then we have come to the panel discussion segment of our webinar. We're very short on time, so I have the challenge to all our speakers to respond very briefly, 1 max 2 minutes. But I'm sure you're all up for the task. We have 4 questions, and I'll start with the first question, which is, how can governments improve coordination among different sectors and ministries? And I will give the floor first to Mr. Peters to speak from the private sector perspective, and then to Mr. Bouwman to speak from the public sector. And in the meantime, also to our other speakers, there are some questions that came in through the Q&A box, and you're invited to answer those through the chat as well. Over to you, Mr. Peters.
Very good, interesting question. Thanks for giving the opportunity to answer. Bottom line, from our perspective, this is all about expectations and ambitions. So in our view, it is crucial that these organizations, these governments actually get together and discuss with themselves, amongst themselves, the bigger picture, the dot on the horizon. They really have to have a kind of a shared view where to go, how to do in terms of roles and responsibilities, but more importantly, in terms of expectations. This is about ownership, this is about teamwork, so this is really about working together. Full stop.
Thank you for being so to the point. Over to you, Mr. Bouwman.
Thank you. I can be short as well, I think. I think the question is about breaking down silos in governance, right? And when I think about breaking down silos in governance, I think when you let the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, be leading, you automatically break down the silos in governance, because water is connected to almost all of the SDGs. And I think when you let SDGs be leading in spatial planning, in financing, etc., should plan for the long term, as the SDGs will only be until 2030, plan beyond 2030. That would be my short answer to this question.
Thank you so much. Making the SDGs leading to break down the silos. Very clear. Thank you. Our second question I will pose to Mr. Chang to speak from Singapore, and to Ms. Akam to speak from Canada. So we'll hear from both countries. The second question is, there is uncertainty when it comes to how much the sea will rise. How are coastal regions dealing with this high uncertainty? So I'll start with you, Mr. Chang.
I think for Singapore, we have basically established a Climate Research Institute of Singapore, the CCRS, to undertake climate science research as well as downscale IPDC projections for Southeast Asia and Singapore. And I think it's important that firstly, we will need to work with the scientists, especially both those of us who are involved in coastal protection, we are basically engineers. We need to work with the scientists because they are the expert in this area. And we need them to sort of guide us on how to use a projection and how to handle the uncertainties in projections. So it's important that we use a spread of models to understand the possible ranges and uncertainties of project, rather than to rely on 1 or 2 models that would think works best for us. So on the coastal protections, I have shared that in Singapore, we adopted a very flexible and adaptable approach to deal with uncertainties of climate change. So instead of designing to an ultimate level of protection or coastal protection, we have or are developing adaptation pathways that charts out possible measures, offer options for future implementation. So we basically go for no regrets or first build implementation interventions with options to adjust in the future. So we monitor, we accuracy level rise and decide on the next course of action when we're better informed by the latest climate science. Thank you.
Thank you for outlining that, Mr. Cheng. Over to you, Ms. Aiken.
Yeah, I think my response is obviously, we have people that are working in Canada to look at what the best science tells us about what is likely to happen on the coast, but obviously they are projections, so they're not precise. And I think the challenge is to design solutions that are flexible and that allow for migration inland of habitats if we are experiencing more sea level rise than we're anticipating or less sea level rise than we're anticipating. So I think building that flexibility into solutions where possible is totally an important approach. But in Canada, I would say that we, in terms of action on the ground, when we're not currently urgently adapting to coastal sea level rise, we need to really step up action in this area. So I'm hoping that the recent initiatives announced are going to drive action there. But I think we know what the problem is more than we know what the solutions are. I think establishing that we have a problem has been fairly it's very complex, but it's more straightforward than actually getting the solutions in place.
Thank you very much for that honest answer. That there's also still a lot of work to be done and solutions to be built and designed. Then for our third question, I will pose this to Ms. Rambali and to Dr. Kissy. How does coastal resilience building balance economic and environmental benefits? So Ms. Rambali, I invite you to start.
Thank you. And thanks for this interesting question. I think it resonates a bit with some points that were made by other panelists in their answer. I think having a shared vision of what you want to achieve and what's the acceptable level of risk is important to then be able to understand how you, in which trade-off you might address in implementing your action. And I think the SDG pyramid is important to refer to as well, and all the different SDG goals also rely on an important and healthy ecosystem. So when we try to quantify the economic benefits and the environmental benefits, we shouldn't forget this and make sure that also to take into account that it's difficult to quantify the environmental benefit in a monetary term, the environmental benefits that some measures provide. And as was highlighted by Canada's presentation, there might be some cost-benefit analysis that might be useful to support decision makers, but we shouldn't. Yeah, we really need to understand the trade-offs in taking one action over the other.
Thank you for making that point on understanding the trade-offs. Over to you, Mr. Kissy, for your perspective from Ghana.
Yeah, thank you very much. One of the observations I made early on in my role is the enormous cost of protecting the coast, and was looking at it to see what benefit do we really get apart from. Of course, we can't quantify life, but yes, we protect lives and properties. But it's important to also get some economic benefits. And so, what we've been doing, looking at how we boost the local economy. Like I said in my presentation, we incorporating measures to boost local fishing activities, breakwater for docking of canoes. We've built a fish market to promote fishing activities, cold store as well. And we're looking at measures that would boost tourism, along the coast, and seeking to attract private sector, participation and investment along the coast. In terms of the environment, we are also working closely with our agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, particularly under the World Cup project, looking at how we also protect the environment and limit the adverse impact our activities on the environment. So in a nutshell, that's what I'll add to what's already been said on the subject. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kissy, for making that point of how tourism and coastal protection can go hand in hand. Then for our final question, and we're speeding along here, I will go to Mr. Bao. Mr. Bao, the question posed to you will be, what is the worst case and best case scenario for coastal resilience in the region in which you work?
So my big fear is that we will be able to protect, and you see that happening now, the sort of high value, rich, high capacity cities, but we will not be able to bring either the resources or the planning and policies together to deal with the other areas that's where people are living that are often more vulnerable, that are less dense. In the United States, that is a real challenge. There's a real divide between those high impact, let's say, coastal cities and the rest. And I fear very much for that gap. I know that we need a whole set of alternative strategies than building these crazy expensive projects that we are now building in New York City. And I am not sure if we in the United States will be able to develop them. And that's why I'm very happy to sort of see here that we're globally thinking about these things and trying to move these things forward. But the types of strategies that I showed are only applicable in a relatively limited way. And knowing that this is a long-term process with a lot of political angles, it's just going to be really challenging to do the things that are not felt as an incredible urgency, except by the people who live in those particular areas.
Thank you, Mr. Bao, for bringing back the focus to protecting the most vulnerable communities and that planning and policies have to work for the most vulnerable groups. With that, I would like to, we've come to the end of our panel discussion. I think also all the questions in the chat have been answered, so thank you for taking the time to do that as well. It was a really rich discussion in which the challenges were shared, the opportunities were shared, including what I heard multiple times where multi-stakeholder and community engagement is essential. We need to work on making regulatory changes and having the SCGs be leading us through coastal protection and integrated coastal zone management. I will leave you with some final, with a quote from Ban Ki-moon, who's the 8th UN Secretary General and Chair of the Board of GCA. Some final words to think about before we close this webinar, and I hand over to Olivia again. Mr. Ban Ki-moon says, saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth, these are one and the same fight. We must connect the dots between climate change, water scarcity, energy shortages, global health, food security, and women's empowerment. Solutions to one problem must be solutions for all. Thank you again to our speakers, our organizers, and for the final words, I will hand over to you, Olivia, to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Aoife, for chairing this event and great job. And again, thank you to all the speakers and to everyone who's tuning in or watching at a later time. Just very quickly, I posted in the chat where you can find the recordings and the recording and the slide decks from this session. I'll add those later today. You can also sign up for our next webinar and join our LinkedIn group. We also have a newsletter you can follow if you aren't following that already, and an online portal where you can submit your own articles and case studies that can be considered for our newsletter. Among those links, they basically are taking you to our water adaptation community microsite or web portal. So on there, you can also find all of our other past events, so past webinars that you might be interested in watching as well. Thank you, everyone. See you, hopefully some of you next week on July 5th on our next webinar. And take care, everyone.